I'm Suzanne Spalding. I'm Senior Advisor here at the Center for Strategic and International Studies, where I lead the Defending Democratic Institutions project. And I'm very pleased to be here today to welcome you to this conversation with the Director of the National Counterintelligence and Security Center, Director Mike Casey, who we are so pleased to have here with us today. This center really got its start back in 2001 with the establishment of the National Counterintelligence Executive, the NCIX. And over the years, that organization has evolved. When the Director of National Intelligence was created, the office moved under the Office of the Director of National Intelligence. It has acquired additional security functions over the years. And in 2014, it became the National Counterintelligence and Security Center rather than the National Counterintelligence Executive Office. And on 18 September 2023, Mike Casey was sworn in as director of this center. Under Mike's leadership, the center has a broad mandate. It leads national level counterintelligence and security programs, including the National Insider Threat Task Force, CI mission management, security clearance policy and reform, supply chain risk mitigation, and security standards and compliance for overseas diplomatic facilities. The center also plays a critical role in outreach to the private sector and other stakeholders on foreign intelligence threats and how to mitigate those. Prior to joining the NCSC, Mike served as the staff director for the Senate Select Committee on Intelligence since 2016, where he had a remarkable record of bipartisan accomplishments for that committee, which is really an incredible feat in these highly partisan times. Before his service on the Senate Intelligence Committee, Mike served on the Armed Services Committee and in total spent over 27 years working for Congress in a variety of positions, most of which had to do with national security. So we're so pleased to have Mike here today with us, and he is going to engage in a conversation with my good friend and colleague, Glenn Gerstel. Glenn served as the General Counsel for the National Security Agency and served under both Democratic and Republican administrations, another rare feat in these days. And before that, he had a long and illustrious career as an attorney in private practice. So with that, I'll turn it over to you, Glenn, for the conversation.
Thank you, Suzanne, and thank you also to our online audience, and thanks to Mike. Mike, actually I'm so delighted to be doing this because I'm getting a chance to turn the tables a little bit. For a number of years, you were the one posing tough questions to me and my organization, and now I get to turn the tables a little bit in your role as a congressional overseer. Now I get to turn the tables, but the questions aren't going to be all that tough because we do want to hear about the critical role your agency plays.
I was a little afraid of the revenge motive for doing this, but
okay,
thank you guys in advance. We've known you both for years, so
yes, we may have a few surprises for you, we'll see. But anyway, when the public thinks about the nation's spy agencies and even the intelligence community, they think of the NSA or the CIA, and yet in many ways, your organization, the National Counterintelligence and Security Center, performs just as critical a role. So Suzanne's mentioned, just gave us a little bit of an overview. Could go into a little more depth about why do we have your agency? Why is it a separate entity? What exactly does it do? And just give us a little better picture of how it fits into the intelligence community as a whole.
Sure. As Suzanne mentioned, we really came about in 2001. It's a little bit in the wake of the Aldrich Ames scandal when it becomes apparent that the CIA and the FBI, while doing great at their own individual counterintelligence missions, really aren't talking together very well. And so that's sort of the origination of what's originally NCIX and has become NCSC. And over time, as Suzanne mentioned, we've added more and more mission space. So we do security clearance reform. We write all the standards for SCIFs, secure classified information facilities across the United States government. We have a lot to do with, looking at embassy security and making sure they're secure. That's in the wake of the Moscow embassy problems, shall we say, challenges that occurred. We have a role in supply chain risk management. We also do a lot of the counterintelligence coordination and deconfliction from across the agencies to make sure that the intelligence community is looking in a coordinated manner at the threats that are faced by critical infrastructure, some other things we'll probably get to. What am I forgetting? We do the National Insider Threat Task Force. We're also the National Operations Security Center. We do a wide variety of things. We like to think of it as, if the United States has a secret and we want to keep it from somebody, like, we're the place where it all comes together, and we coordinate and deconflict and sort of help write policy for the rest of the IC, and in some cases the rest of the United States government, to help do that. So.
And in terms of organizational structure, you report to whom and
I report to the DNI. Since 2001, we've been part of the Office of the Director of National Intelligence, and so that is a daily conversation with my boss, the DNI, of like, oh, wait, we need to do some more stuff, boss.
Right. So as you describe that, your counterintelligence mission, which has lots of different facets, you're not the only one within the federal government, obviously, that does CI counterintelligence. Can you help us draw some of the lines here, the swim lanes, so to speak, to use the buzz term? Because we've got the FBI, the internal security operations and apparatus within each spy agency to look at its own personnel. Right. We've got other agencies, especially the Department of Defense, which has a huge role in this, including the Defense Counterintelligence and Security Agency, which has a name very similar to yours. I don't know, do you ever get annoyed that they have a similar name? I mean, you were there first, and they sort of came after you. Was that flattery, or is it something else?
It depends on the day of how we feel about them. No, I think we were technically the second NCSC anyway. I think the New Zealanders had one first, although it's a cyber center, and then the Brits copied our name. It's also a cyber center. So. Yes. The biggest problem we have is people saying, like, you guys do all the cyber stuff. I'm like, no, we don't. That's somebody else. But to your original question, there are a lot of counterintelligence entities in the United States government. A lot of them are more tactical and operational. The FBI obviously is in charge of investigating and chasing spies. We don't do that. When you look at the movie and you see the guy chase the spy across the hotel lobby, like, that's not us. We're the guys having the meeting 3 weeks before, helping make sure that the FBI and the CIA are talking to each other and thinking about protecting our secrets in the right way. So we're much more in the policy and coordination side of that. If any of us are ever chasing a spy across the lobby, something's gone horribly wrong, and we're well outside our authorities. So like that's kind of the way we think about it. We don't do the grassroots level, tactical level. We do the 10,000-foot policy and strategy.
But you still must have a lot of daily coordination.
All the time.
And on things like supply chain for the defense industrial base, is that more the defense industry? Is that more the other agency that I mentioned, which is part of DOD, or is that part of you, or do you work together?
We work together quite a bit. We run the Director of National Intelligence Supply Chain Risk Management Task Force, which is basically a huge number of government agencies that come together to share supply chain risk information and to make sure we're all looking at the threats in the same way and sharing information. So DCSA, we play with them every single day. Also GSA, all the usual suspects in that area.
So lots of coordination.
There is a lot of coordination and a lot of sharing. It's a real growth business for us, unfortunately, which is honestly kind of a theme for everything we do.
Exactly. So back to you for a second personally. Sure. You're now celebrating just a little over your 1-year anniversary in the job, so congratulations. So first, how did you get the job? And you were as Suzanne mentioned, you were the staff director for the Senate committee, so you had knowledge of all these issues for sure, because that's what you covered. And yet, was the transition from years in the congressional side to the executive branch easy? Did it feel natural, or were there lots of new challenges?
How did I get the job? The short answer is I think the DNI called and asked. As Suzanne mentioned, I'd been on the Hill for almost 28 years, I think, at that point where she called, and it was probably long since time to do something else. But Director Haynes called and asked if I was interested in the job, and absolutely. I talked to Bill Evanina and Mike Orlando a large number of times. It seemed like a really interesting and intriguing spot to sit at the intersection of a lot of, frankly, very interesting and very important issues. So leapt at the chance, and remarkably enough, I was confirmed. It helps when you're the staff director for the committee that's in charge of doing the vetting and the hearing. So scheduling your own hearing is definitely an advantage in that process.
You were actually confirmed by the very committee that you were actually.
If they had voted no, it would have been uncomfortable for a lot of people.
The very committee for which, okay,
it's a little bit of an advantage.
Okay, well, that was easy. And
Right.
what about the shift from legislative to executive branch? Because that has to be completely different on some levels.
On some levels, absolutely. Yes, sitting where I was, you get a view of all these issues and the intersection, and it's one of the reasons the job was intriguing, is that it does sit at the intersection of a lot of these sort of very important things that are going on right now. It is a very big switch from working on the Hill, particularly as a staff director. If you can spend 30 seconds on any one issue, you're getting to focus and.
Right.
Showing up on day one, and you have a much, very broad mandate in NCSC, it's still you're very much focused on one organization and one set of issues, and so that's been both a switch but also a real pleasure. At the same time, because the mandate is so broad, you still get a little bit of that. I get to do, and we have to do 30 different things every day. So there's some similarities, but it's been a good switch. I've really enjoyed it. So
Good. I'm sure it must be fascinating on both sides. So back to the organization, as Suzanne mentioned, the organization is now your organization. The NCSC is coming up on its
NCSC number 2, now
exactly,
number
the
3 in the
exactly.
world.
Okay, we're going to have to be careful about that. It's coming up on its 10th birthday, right?
Correct,
We're going to ask you about the birthday celebrations that are planned, but it grew out of prior organizations that had a CI function for many years. Presumably this was in response to the evolving nature of the threat, and sort of when I think about CI in the old days in the Cold War, I have images of KGB operatives with tiny little cameras taking pictures of files in a darkened hallway. I'm sure while that may still be the issue, that's no longer the focus today. Can you walk us through a little bit of that evolution and how CI threats have morphed and evolved over the years? And then maybe you can talk about some of the specific countries and how your organization has reacted to that.
Sure. So you still get some of the spy in the back room with the camera, that
Right.
still happens.
Okay, yeah.
It's very comforting that hasn't gone away on some level. I think the biggest evolution we've seen, though, is you have more players going after more targets and with more different techniques and means than used to. Our joke is CSIS turned out to be a growth business, so I guess that's good. It's real mixed blessing, but you have a lot more where it was primarily the Russians in the Cold War looking at government secrets or things that supported the government, stealing Lockheed's latest plans for whatever. You really have, you can think about the Russians, the Chinese, the North Koreans, the Iranians, a host of other people going after a lot more targets. So it's not just government secrets anymore. It's effectively intellectual property or data or all the things that support American security and advantages in the world. People are trying to steal, and you have just a much more wide variety of ways that they're going about it, whether it's the classic spy or it's cyber or it's intellectual property theft in a wide variety of mechanisms. And so you can just look at as an example of how this is proliferated across the world, growth in spyware companies out there. The number of vendors that sell across the world has grown. The number of countries that can buy it has grown. It gets easier and easier to use, and that kind of growth really enables there to be many, many more players in the intelligence business that actually present a real threat to the United States and to the things we want to protect. And so that's pretty much a microcosm of how this has evolved. I think you can just look at the number of duties we take on as a reflection of that. So, it's not just designing SCIFs and coordinating counterintelligence. It is the supply chain function. We have an enormous, brings us here in some part, the enormous outreach function, which is focused on reaching out to private industry and helping them think about how to protect themselves and providing advice. And so, yeah, we continue to evolve to try and meet this evolving threat.
Is it fair to say, am I putting words in your mouth if I say that the biggest single change in evolution over whatever, since Cold War days, has been the shift from focusing on a CI threat to the government and the public sector to more the private sector, or is that and do you have any sense of the balance of how much time you focus on protecting the government's own secrets versus the private sector's secrets?
An exact balance would be hard. It depends on the day, what the threat is. I mean, I guess the way we think about it, one, you have the classic Russian threat. And then, in particular, the PRC becomes the pacing threat in a lot of ways. It's true for us, too. The shorthand version we talk about is, Xi Jinping has this theory that American national preeminence is based on our technological advantages, and that those have fed the best military and the best economy, and he wants that. And they're very blatant about coming after it. And so that has driven our growth in how do we help companies protect themselves? How do we think about that? And so it is a greater and greater involvement every day of how we talk to the private sector. It is, you ask about balance, it is probably 30 to 40% of every day is spent on, we may be doing this to the government, but we're also going to have to do it to the private sector, or just talking directly to the private sector. These are the threats. These are the things we think you could do to protect yourselves.
Sure. So that obviously must stretch you thin a little bit in the sense of not only do you have to protect the government, but the private sector. And in some ways, it strikes me that there's a bit of an analogy with cybersecurity in the sense of much of the burden here falls on the private sector. They're the ones, after all, in the crosshairs. They're the target. They've got the secrets that China and others want. And yet in the cybersecurity realm, we know that burden of defending your own computer networks and your IT systems falls on the private sector, even when there's a foreign adversary involved. Yep. And of course, we wouldn't tolerate that situation if the foreign adversary was doing something physical, dropping a bomb. That's clearly not the responsibility of the private sector to protect itself from that. That's what the government. So is there some parallel there with your organization that a lot of the burden falls on the private sector?
Yeah, I mean, look, the reality is we can help them protect themselves. Right. We are not going to be able to protect them all the time. The United States government is not going to have security people inside a private company to root out the spies. So a lot of what we're doing is taking government information, taking government best practices, translating that into the private sector, doing outreach, hoping to get some sort of feedback mechanisms so that we can better inform the lessons they're seeing, the things they're seeing can better inform the advice we're providing and better inform our intelligence. And you've seen some evolution in how this happens. You can think about, we've seen some industries. We had one industry we were focusing on a couple years back pretty heavily and they were very much under threat from the PRC. We were trying to help them work through that. They, to their credit, started self-organizing. Their CISOs, their chief security officers, formed their own organization to start, regardless of competitive status, sharing security information, providing one place we could feed into, places they could feed back. So you see a lot of that recognition in the private sector, that particularly among mid-sized and bigger companies, that they're facing a challenge and that the government can't do it alone, and that we want to help them and that they want to help us, and how do we better cooperate? So it definitely is spreading us thin, but at the same time, you're definitely seeing some of the private sector folks reorganize or think about better ways they can do it on their own.
Right. So you've mentioned both Russia and China. I want to make sure we spend time on both of those during our program here. Our old adversary was the Soviet Union, and now the Russian Republic with its significant, very extensive espionage efforts through the GRU, the SVR, the FSB, all the initials that are familiar to those in the business, so to speak. They're the spy agencies. But now China is becoming much more aggressive and in some ways equaling or even outpacing perhaps some of the Russian efforts we see. There have been lots of recent reports about apparent Chinese penetration of cyber networks in the critical infrastructure area. There have been some very recent reports about apparent Chinese cyber intrusions into telecom and broadband networks, which could be potentially, sounds very alarming. And of course that follows years of reports of theft of industrial espionage going after critical trademarks, patents, know-how, et cetera. Could you talk just a little more, let's particularly continue on the China, a little more about their national objectives? You touched upon that a little bit. What exactly are they looking for? What does America have that they want? Is it, I mean, they've got some resources that we don't have, rare earth minerals, et cetera, and others. They've got some technical capabilities and manufacturing capabilities that we don't have. Maybe we could have, but it's centered there. So what are they looking for? What are they missing? And what does private industry need to particularly worry about in that regard?
Sure. As I was alluding to before, I mean, the theory of American technological prowess, is our base advantage. That allowed us in a lot of ways to organize the world and help set a lot of the international standards for, you think about, I think 5G was a big thing a few years ago. So all those standards were set by the United States. The PRC would very much like to be in that position of driving technology and standards across the world and allowing it to impose their models. So they are looking at those cutting edge things in particular. When you think of AI or quantum or semiconductors or autonomous vehicles, they've actually made a list of the things they're interested in. It's the Made in China 2025 and the latest 5-year plan, which I think they put out a couple years ago. It's literally a couple lists of those technology areas that they're interested in, and you literally see them going after those things in every way possible, whether it's, again, like a cyber theft, whether it's hiring an insider. They do talent recruitment, legitimate and illegitimate, so I think you can see the 1,000 Talents program. In some cases, they are supporting people who work for companies. I think it was Apple, like they had their third engineer who's working on their autonomous vehicle program leave. I think Google got hit a couple times. They're just hiring these folks, and then they set up an equivalent company inside China. You see, all sorts of, we call it malign investment, but effectively disguised investments in an effort to someone comes in and invests in a small company, gets access to the IP, and then takes it and sets up a competitor back in China. You just see, inside the space of things that they want to go after, 1,000 different ways that they're doing it.
Is it fair to characterize it or unfair to characterize it as mostly high tech, or is China interested in basic industries and fundamental industrial processes as well, or do they have that already and it's more the high-tech leading edge stuff?
We mostly see it in high-tech. You definitely see it in some other areas. Agriculture has been a focus of China for a long time for some obvious reasons. Feeding 1.3 billion people
and that
is
includes
a challenge.
Crop genetics and other things like that.
There's classic stories of seed, IP theft of seeds. But mostly we see this in sort of the high-tech industries.
And is the extent of their efforts more focused on industry? Because we've also heard reports about academia in this area.
Wherever the IP is where they'll go after. And so a lot of the 1,000 Talents programs were aimed at academia and bringing them to China, setting them up in a lab, or sending graduate students in.
And are you still seeing that, or is that abated a little bit, or what?
You still see it.
As these tensions have tightened, we've been cutting back on academic exchanges, et cetera.
You still see some of it. I mean, there's still efforts. It's definitely sort of ebbing and at the moment. Some of that amounts decreases the greater awareness, and we've seen a lot greater awareness and cooperation from academia. I mean, I think that was a fairly difficult conversation for them for a long time about academic freedom.
And change for industry too.
Sure.
I mean, there's been a change as the nature of the threat has become more apparent. I think there's definitely been an attitude change.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. So you're definitely. The 5-6 years ago, in my prior job, giving Senator Warner a lot of credit, he started talking to a lot of industry and academia about China and IP theft, and the initial conversation was, really, that's a problem? The conversation now is much less, that's a problem, and much more of a, we agree, what do we do about it? How do we help each other in facing this? So that's a very welcome transition
Right,
for everybody.
Mike, I want to go back to a point you alluded to and explore that a little more. We've been hearing more about how adversaries, especially China, who want our data and technology, don't have to resort just to cyber maliciousness. There's other ways of getting it, and they can exploit our open system, good old-fashioned American capitalism and investment.
Yeah.
You mentioned that as a route. Can you talk to us a little more about that? How does China in particular take advantage in a perfectly legal way, I take it, or maybe quasi-legal on the edges of things? How do they take advantage of our open system, so to speak? Couldn't do this in China, where everything has to be approved. Each investment has to be approved by Americans, carefully monitored. You have to form a joint venture with a local partner, et cetera. We don't have that here.
Correct.
So we're maybe at a disadvantage. I don't know. I mean, there's an advantage, obviously, having an open sensor, but from a CI point of view, it creates more challenges for you. Can you talk about what the Chinese are doing in this area of legal investment?
Sure. What we see.
Do you have any examples? Maybe if I can put you on the spot.
Sure. Classically, what you see is a Chinese investor, either directly or now a lot more through fronts in Europe or here, go to a small company. And sort of two different ways of doing it. One is just through due diligence, asking a lot of questions. Tell me about your IP, describe it. Maybe they get access to some of it, and then the investor disappears. And remarkably enough, a competitor using very, very, very similar technology somehow starts up in China. The other model is, it's bizarre how this happens. The other model is they actually do invest, and then the same thing happens, the IP disappears. So a classic example, one we like to use, it's actually a British company, so it makes it more comfortable to talk about in America. A small engineering company called Smiths Harlow, of all things. It's a British names. Probably has an extra U in there somewhere.
Right.
They had a small company. The Chinese investor shows up, offers to invest, says they want to invest $10 million, I think it was. Put down a down payment of $3 or $4 million, get access to the IP, suddenly pull out of the deal. Suddenly the IP shows up in China, there's a competitor, and Smiths Harlow is now a failing company. And to make matters worse, they had some MOD contracts in Britain, which now that they have
UK Ministry of Defense,
UK Ministry of Defense, and now that they have in theory, a Chinese investor of some amount, they've got some amount of money. The Ministry of Defense is saying, wait a minute. So they're losing on both sides, and that highlights something. One of the messages we say too, not only can you lose your IP, but as you think about this as a supply chain risk, which is one way to think about it, having PRC built into your supply chains for critical military or critical technology things is maybe a risk we don't want to take. If you have those investors, you're also at risk of not ever getting a DoD contract or US government contract. So it presents challenges from both ends of that, but that's sort of how that model works in most cases.
So these legal investments.
It's a legal investment that does not go well for.
Right. And isn't necessarily in the U.S. subject to any approval. I mean, there could be ones that trip the CSIS trigger, but a lot will fall under that.
Yeah, and you see a lot of efforts to get around that, whether it's making the deals very complicated, whether like running the investments through another country that doesn't get as high a degree of scrutiny.
Sure, just hide behind a screen.
All the usual ways you'd assume that somebody tries.
And you
to
mentioned this was in agricultural too. There have been a lot of stories about Chinese buying up farmland near important plants to get or military bases, and I assume your agency takes a look at that, although is that partly state function too, or?
A variety of people plan that. I mean, I'm not sure in the racking and stacking of, threats, like that's one that's a little hard to get your hands around.
Right.
But there are, definitely the government has taken a look at that.
Sure, but I guess the point I would make is that it illustrates the integrated and pervasive nature of the Chinese threat. It's not just one channel, one particular vector. It's a whole bunch of.
It would be a lot easier if it was just the MSS and one unit that the U.S. branch of the MSS was focused on. Yes. Please go steal the latest plans for a tank. Like you'd know what to do about that.
Exactly.
But it is a much more pervasive threat from many more angles.
Well, speaking of that pervasive threat, I guess one way to impose some sort of strategic discipline or concrete thinking about this is the new National Counterintelligence Strategy, which your office issued, what, a few months ago, I guess?
It was signed by the president on August 1st.
Okay,
So.
and I'm sure that was many months in the making. That's not our first such strategy, am I correct in that regard?
You are correct. We do it every 3 years or so.
Okay,
so.
and what's new and different about this one? Why is this better than the last? And
Yeah, well,
what
of
do we
course.
need to think about?
You
Well,
know,
of course.
New,
We
the,
know
new,
why it's
well, the new
better.
director makes everything better.
Of course.
No, you're 100% correct. This was years in the making.
Right.
In fact, we're already starting to write the
You're
bases
already on the
for
next one, yes,
Yeah.
right.
Well, you start writing some of the pieces that feed into it almost
Sure.
right away. It's a cross-government, multi-agency strategy. We coordinate this thing across the IC. The intent is to provide a strategic vision of kind of the threat and the way forward. And it's one of the interesting things you see about this one, and in truth, the one that was just prior to it, is these are public. Historically, the National Counterintelligence Strategy was a classified document. And I think this is points to one of the signs in the evolution of the kind of threat and how we have to go about it is if it was just people trying to steal government secrets, we could write a classified strategy and it'd be great, no one would have to know about it. But because we have to do so much work with the private sector, and we have to make it public to explain how we're thinking about this, how we're going about it, and provide direction. If you look at, there's sort of 3 broad branches and then 9 goals under it. All typically sort of government strategy, broad speak. But if you actually look at the goals, you'll see, I think it's 8 of the 9 all have some component of outreach or engagement with the private sector.
Sure.
So that's just a huge part of this. That is where we're facing the real threat these days.
And what's been if I may, what's been the reaction of the private sector to it? And you mentioned outreach. What could you tell us a little bit of what you're doing to sort of spread the word, and how are you engaging with them? What's the reaction you're getting? And
the reaction from the private sector to all of our outreach has broadly been very there's a high demand. It's much more of a.
So you're not getting people who in the private sector say, we don't need help from the government, we don't want you knowing more about our...
No, I mean, you occasionally, but the vast majority of companies, the vast majority of industries are, we want to partner, we want to do more, help us protect ourselves.
Because that isn't always the case in cyber, I might add, an area
Sure.
that I'm more familiar with, where sometimes the government will say, we'd like to help you, and sometimes the industry is very receptive and say, we need all the help we can get. Other times they'll say, we've got this handled. Thank you.
Yeah, broadly speaking, we are getting a very good, very positive reaction to please help us. I think some of that's probably, we're not an intrusive help. We're much more of these are the kinds of threats, these are maybe some of the best practices you can do. I think.
Do you find industry is aware of the threats, or are you educating them about things that they don't know, and when you have a meeting with them, they say, gosh, we didn't realize that?
Both. It depends on the size and sophistication of the industry. So we definitely, you have some larger companies who've been in this game for a long time, and they've thought about security, and so they are generally aware of the threats, and their asks tend to be more like, help us with the evolving TTPs, techniques, tactics, and practices of the bad guys. Help us have that conversation. Right. You get some smaller companies or people who haven't thought about it who are like, gosh, that seems bad. How do we go about?
How are you doing this outreach? Are you affirmatively meeting with industry organizations, or what's the?
We do it in a lot of different ways. We issue, you alluded to the bulletin we put out about investment before. Yes. We do, so we do a lot of public bulletins that just highlight the threat.
Which are on your website.
Which are on the website. We distribute them to the media and through industry organizations. We meet with a lot of the industry associations because my center isn't that big. This is a great way of doing it. We try to do a lot of coordination across the rest of the IC and the United States government to make sure that we're all having the same message and each hitting our own niche audiences effectively. We do things like this.
Good.
Well, not as important as this one, of course. But
not as effective as this
not as
one.
effective as that, right? Exactly. We have a wide variety and a growing variety of ways we do it. So a lot of them tend to be centered around sort of the bulletins we put out, because that provides a focus for us to engage. So.
Sure. I was talking to a company that was very aware of the Chinese threat because they had a significant reliance on a Chinese supply chain. They got their parts for critical elements of their product from China. And they were telling me in a different context that this is a real challenge for them because they rely on China. I mean, the reality is their parts are sourced in China. And the Wall Street Journal, I think a couple of weeks ago, had an article you probably saw about how this is a particularly challenging issue for tech startups that in these high-tech areas rely on many of the things that are pretty much exclusively made, or at least economically efficiently made, in China. We're talking about motors, sensors, some other batteries is a great example. It's really hard to source batteries in the United States, for example. So, are some of these startups sort of just doomed to live with the problem? Is this like a chronic disease, chronic condition that they have to live with, or what's the?
We try to be sort of realistic about this. We're not. It is not my policy, my center's job to run around and say decouple from China. What we're trying to say is, if you're going to take risks, like understand the risks you're taking and manage them in a smart way. So if you have a high degree of reliance on China for supply chains and it's something relatively innocuous like gears, like, okay, that's probably not the same level of risk as if you're, setting up shop in China and you're storing your IP there, that you might want to think about that a little differently. So even in the supply chain context, we sort of say, like, reliance on China is one thing, total reliance on China is probably something else. You should think about, are there ways to diversify? Are there ways to manage your business activities in China more smartly in ways that maybe don't expose you to this, to an unacceptable level of risk?
And in some ways, this problem may get better over years as we recognize the nature of the Chinese supply chain risk, and some products we put back onshoring, put back here in the United States, develop a little more battery technology, for example. But inevitably, in a global economy, we're going to be dealing with Chinese products.
It doesn't seem realistic to fully decouple from China. And
so it's just about managing it in a smart way.
Manage your risk, be smart, don't take.
Do you find that industry gets together and collaborates a little bit on some of these issues, particularly supply chain issues, and with your help or so?
It depends on the industry. Some are more, more sophisticated than others. I think the semiconductor industry is actually pretty good, pretty aware, pretty organized, talk to each other a lot, but other industries not as much. You definitely see more of them trying to organize and being interested in that, so which is all good.
On one hand, they're worried about competitive pressures and tension. There's antitrust issues about collaborating, et cetera, and yet in this area there seems like some information sharing. Again, cyber's an analog. Cyber's an analog to that area where it may make sense.
I think that's right, and we try to make the pitch like security is not really a competitive advantage necessarily. It's sort of something you should all do. No one makes a huge profit by having additional security, but at the same time it may be key to avoiding huge losses and going out of business and hurting all our national security. So please, so we encourage that organization. It also, the more industries organize, whether it's a trade association or informal exchange, the easier it is for the government to interject and have the conversation with them too. So it's helpful to everybody, I think.
Okay. All right, we've spent a lot of time on China. Let's go back to our original nemesis, so to speak, Russia in this regard. How does the Russian CI threat differ from the Chinese one? And in particular, I want to draw your attention to, there were some recent articles about their apparent Russian sabotage operations, actual industrial sabotage operations in Europe against companies that were supporting Ukraine, supplying arms and munitions to Ukraine. Should U.S. companies be similarly worried about that? Is that just something that they're going to conduct on European soil? Go ahead.
I was going to say that. The metaphor, I forget who came up with it, but is the Russians are a hurricane and China's climate change. In the short term, the Russians are in-your-face violence, hyper aggressive, all the things we remember from the Cold War. So they are classic espionage. They've sabotage. You see kind of that sort of gamut. It's not the same. Are you
aware of specific sabotage operations in Europe that anything?
Well, I think the Europeans have highlighted a number of them. I mean, the Poles have arrested a number of people. I think the head of MI5 was out giving a speech about this the other day. That the Russians absolutely seem to have gone after a number of companies, a number of modes of transportation, that sort of thing, all designed to disrupt support for Ukraine, it seems.
And transferring that across the Atlantic, do we need to worry about it?
Haven't seen it yet. I think it's definitely something we should be concerned about. We would particularly suggest that companies who are involved in helping to support Ukraine in particular, helping transport things to Ukraine, be fully aware and take whatever security measures.
I mean, certainly a lot of the arms and munitions for Ukraine are created here.
And I mean, just because you haven't seen it yet doesn't mean it can't happen. Should people be cautious about it? Absolutely. Should large arms suppliers, security folks be hyper aware of this and think about their operations in Europe in particular? There have been a lot of lines crossed in the conflict with Ukraine. So, you are seeing for the first time the Ukrainians holding Russian territory,
yes.
And they are doing it with weapons that were largely produced in the West. That is a line that no one's crossed before. So where that goes.
And who knows where that's going, right, exactly.
Right. So we would urge all companies to think about that pretty seriously.
Stepping it up one level, even more ominously, there's been indications of the Kremlin apparently behind some actual assassination, not just a sabotage, but actual assassination attempts, certainly of dissidents and others in Europe and elsewhere. We've seen that, and defectors, et cetera.
Yep.
I think it was in Spain there was a helicopter pilot or something. Apparently a target or so,
9
whatever.
times, right?
Again, do we need to worry about that sort of thing in the U.S. or not really? Or what's? And they certainly in the U.K. there were Russian agents former Russian agents who were targets being killed on UK soil, being killed on UK soil.
Litvinenko, Skripal. There's a long list.
It's not too far-fetched to imagine that happening here.
So, you've seen the Russians do that for a long time. Skripal, Litvinenko. You can go down the list of the large number of Russians who've tragically fallen out of windows across Europe. Which these
windows are a problem.
Apparently, we have not really seen that here. The one case we can point to is we found a Mexican national back in 2020 who appeared to be surveilling a Russian dissident, but ultimately seems to have mostly just taken a picture of his license plate. We don't know why he was surveilling the Russian, but we haven't actually seen the Russians carry out or an attempt an assassination in the United States. That's the one outlier. Again, who knows where this goes? If they think that's a red line that they can cross for some reason, we don't know. But we haven't seen that here in the United States explicitly. But certainly that activity continues across basically the rest of the globe.
Right. Yeah. Well, hopefully we don't see it here in the U.S. And talking about the rest of the globe, maybe a bit of an unfair question. I don't mean it that way, but we've focused mostly on Russia and China, understandably so. I think that's fair to characterize as the bulk of the threat from your agency. Are there other countries that you focus on too? Is it how much of your resources are sort of China and Russia? I don't mean to again put you on the spot, but I mean there are other adversaries out there too.
There are 100% other. I mean, you can just do the usual suspects of Iran and North Korea, Cuba to some extent. I think we tend to look at it from the security side. We look at it as China is the PRC is the pacing threat. If you help protect against that sort of thing, particularly when it comes to the private sector, then Iran and North Korea are probably sort of lesser included threats. But they each present their own unique challenges.
I assume Iran was looking for nuclear technology anywhere it can find it, for example.
Iran's looking, 100%. But again, that's so is Russia, so is China. So you can kind of package them inside that. China and Russia are by far our biggest focuses. By far, China is the driver of the growth business. But as I alluded to sort of at the beginning of this, whether it's through spyware or through other technological, more and more countries can play in this, and it becomes a bigger and bigger problem. It's really just a matter of, are you willing to shell out the relatively minimal investment for the software, the spyware, whatever it is, and then pick your target and go after it. And it is a growth industry.
It is a growth industry, sadly.
Right. I feel bad smiling about that.
No, I know. Of course, it's a serious problem. I think my own sense is that industry is cognizant of the problem and waking up to it and recognizing the nature of it after some years of, arguably overlooking it in the race to for economic efficiency, et cetera. But you're right.
I mean, also, look, some of that's the hangover from the Cold War and
Sure,
then the war on
sure.
terrorism, is that you didn't see private industry being the focus.
Right.
I mean, sure, some, if you were a defense supplier,
Right.
in the Cold War, the Russians were going to come look for technology,
Right.
but they were looking at building a better tank, not building a better,
Right.
autonomous vehicle, widget, whatever it is. And so, it takes a while to change in the face of a different threat.
Do you see your agency growing in that regard to meet the threat? I mean, obviously, every director of every agency in Washington always wants more of a budget and more staff. But what's your sort of sense of where things might look in the future?
I think our focus is, at least, one, we fully support the president's budget. This is the required.
Yes, of course.
But I think our focus in the short term is really about how do we improve our coordination across the government to do. So we talked to a lot of private sector outreach. There's a lot of people in the federal government. We're not the only people doing
Right.
outreach to the private sector. So how do we just make sure we're doing that better coordinated, more efficiently, sharing the same messages, not all showing up on the same company's door, because
Right.
that's a real
Sure.
thing. Like, I'm from the federal government, I'm here to help.
Yes.
Well, you're the sixth one this week.
Yes, right.
Go away. Also making sure our outreach and coordination and cooperation is appropriate and aimed in the right way. Like, giving you, showing up in your door and saying you should be more secure is not actually that useful over time,
Right.
but here's the kinds of things you should worry about. Here's the kinds of measures that we have seen in other places be effective. That's better. So I think in the short term, the focus is a lot more coordination, collaboration, tweaking our assistance. In the long run, I mean, it's a difficult budget environment for everybody. So we'll see.
Yeah. Well, of course, as you've said, China's the pacing threat in this area.
Mm-hmm.
And in some respects, my own editorial comment, I sometimes wonder if in some areas where we characterize, and you don't need to comment on this, my own editorial thought is, we characterize China as a pacing threat because it isn't politically correct to say they're ahead of us in a couple of areas, but I think there arguably may be some areas in technology where they may, in fact, be ahead of us. And I think it's important for us to sort of really understand the nature of the threat in that regard, and react to it if it really is, as severe as we think it is in some cases. All right. Well, we've had a real tour of the horizon here. Let me ask you one final question,
Sure.
just because I know it's up on everybody's mind. I can't resist. We're doing this session just a couple of weeks before the election, and I realize your agency is not in charge
right.
of the securing the elections, but you are part of ODNI. You do coordinate with these organizations. What are your thoughts about the security of this election in terms of the foreign interference? Because the same spies that are busy trying to steal something are also the same ones in Russia and China that are trying to affect our elections.
I think my counterparts in the Foreign Malign Influence Center, who are the ones who are charged with election, just did their 30-day update the other day. I mean, you see the Russians and the Iranians in particular trying to interfere in the presidential election for weirdly different candidates. The Chinese seem to be playing in local state-level elections, not very much on the presidential or national. But yeah, you 100% continue to see other countries attempt to interfere or influence in our election. I should say influence. They don't. I don't think
We're
we've
not talking
seen
about changing votes and ballot machinery.
Yeah, I don't think
Right,
we've seen
right.
them go after the
Right.
infrastructure and
Right.
the election in any way or in any significant way. It's much more about influencing the votes and promoting or denigrating certain candidates.
Yeah, and of course, the argument is in a very, very tight election, some influence operations in a closely contested election may well have an effect. I mean, could change outcomes.
I mean, the IC, we do not look at the United States.
Sure.
Get that out there. So we have no way of measuring. We have no way of measuring
right.
impact, and I candidly don't think that the IC should be involved in really measuring
I was just
impact.
making an editorial comment. Yes, right.
I think if you go back and looked at the Senate Select Committee on Intelligence did an investigation into the Russians' interference in 2016.
Which was bipartisan.
Which was led by Senator Burr, who was a Republican, and co-led by Vice Chairman at the time, now Chairman Warner, and then ultimately Senator Rubio. And they, that points out that the Russians thought they were pouring champagne the night of the election. Whether or not they had an impact, they clearly think this kind of thing either works or can work, and so they'll keep doing it.
Well, we'll see. We've got a few more weeks to go. Hopefully, it won't be as pernicious or effective as feared. I'll give you opportunity for. Is there anything I missed that you want to comment on, or foot stomp, so to speak, or underscore?
No, I just thank you for this opportunity. It's great to see you both. This has been a great discussion. So
this is great. Well, I hope it gets a lot of online distribution, because the message that you're conveying is really important for our country, particularly the private sector, but generally the public as a whole. Suzanne, I don't know if you have any final comments or anything else, but thank you for helping host this.
Oh, absolutely. A great conversation. I'm glad I was able to be here to hear it. And Mike, always great to see you. Thank you for making time. It's really pretty remarkable how broad your writ is and how much you guys have to do. And I know what a lean organization you are. And so to be able to carve out this kind of time is really meaningful. Having said that, no good deed goes unpunished.
No.
We hope to get you back again sometime. I am remembering that I think it was around 2010, one of your predecessors co-hosted with the American Bar Association a program entitled No More Secrets.
Oh, interesting.
And the theory... Yeah,
I'm not sure we're in favor of that.
But, yeah, right.
But we can talk about it.
I'll send you the report. And the theory was, and I talk about this a lot, as Glenn knows, that the reality is the shelf life of secrets is vanishingly short, and the world is becoming more and more transparent. The ability to keep information secret it becomes harder and harder, and whoever figures out how to operate with fewer secrets is going to prevail in that environment. And that while even as we have secrets we need to protect today, we need to be thinking about where we go in that world that's coming at us, because we want to be prepared, and we have the advantage as a democracy over totalitarian regimes who need secrets that they keep from their public.
That would be a great conversation to have.
I'd love to have you back.
A few thoughts on that is the people who are, on the security side with security clearance reform and helping do a lot on the physical side. The fewer secrets you have to keep, the easier it is to defend them. And so that's we at the same time as a government, we seem to be, frankly, sort of struggling with that concept, shall I say. It is too easy to classify and too hard to declassify things.
That's which is a really important, it's a conversation we've been having for decades, right? Overclassification makes it harder to keep secrets.
It's overclassified, and then information systems, I forward you an email that has now, I've created, I send you a document, you reply to me, we involve other people in a discussion. You've now created 100 records that are all classified that I have to maintain. It's really what I care about is the original attachment. Like, what's a good way of working through that and just not, I don't know yet. But I'd love to have that conversation.
Great. All right. Well, I'm going to take that as a willingness to come back, and we'll really look forward to it. And thank you to all of you who have tuned in and who are watching this on demand. Really appreciate your being part of this as well. Thank you.
Thank you.